you could, yeah, okay, never mind. Okay, everybody, welcome and thanks for joining today. This is an AFN Network Plus webinar. I'm Jez Fredenberg. I'm based at the Tyndall Centre for Climate Change Research and the University of East Anglia, where I'm the Knowledge Exchange Fellow for the AFN Network Plus. Also with me today is my colleague Neil Ward, who's a co-lead of the project. Just so you know a little bit, the AFN Network Plus is focused on the UK agri-food system. Essentially, UKRI, our funder, has tasked us with identifying research gaps that could help fund that it could help fund the transition towards a net zero UK, as well as improving rural livelihoods, biodiversity, and food security. Part of that is these webinars as a knowledge exchange activity. So today's topic, I wanted to just set the scene really with a summary paragraph from the Lord's Horticulture Sector Select Committee inquiry, which was published in November, which said, horticulture, the vital £5 billion industry focusing on fruit, vegetables and ornamental plants, is at a crossroads. The sector is under-prioritised and unappreciated by policymakers, leaving holes in the UK's food security and ability to meet net zero goals. So, of course, this is at a time when most food system transformation models often rest on us all eating more fruit and veg and less meat and dairy, and also at a time when many of the regions that the UK relies on for fruit and veg imports are projected to face severe drying due to climate change. You can see more about that in last month's webinar from Pete Feline from the Met Office, which is on our website. So what do we do about all of this? Well, I'm very pleased that Lee Stiles is presenting for us today. Lee is very well known in the sector and a sought-after voice on these issues. He's the secretary of Lee Valley Growers Association, often referred to as Britain's cucumber, sweet pepper and aubergine capital, and he regularly talks to the media and inputs to government on these topics. So this will be part one of a two-part webinar, and Lee will be focusing on vegetables and salad crops today, and then in a couple of weeks, Ali Kappa will present in part two on fruit. We'll be sharing those links in a minute. If you have any questions for Lee as we go along, please write them in the Q&A. Please can you use the chat function just for discussion and sharing links so we can find your questions more easily. We're obviously recording this session to put it on YouTube for other people to see. So if you don't want to be identified as participating for any reason, then probably best either not to ask a question or do so anonymously. So Lee, over to you. I know you've already shared your slides, so yeah, I'm handing over to you right now. Thanks very much.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Jez, Neil and the AFN for inviting me, and of course to everyone for joining today. The question is, how do we grow more local food? Why do we need to? And how can the UK research community help?
Lee, sorry, just before you carry on, could you please put your video on so we can see you? And you're on mute as well now. Brilliant, thank you. Great.
Okay, could you hear that?
Yeah, we could hear that. We just couldn't see you, and it's nice to be able to see you. Thank you.
So if we go back to 2016, you may remember it was quite an eventful year. We were told by the experts that leaving the EU would mean cheaper food for everyone. Then in March 2020, another memorable period, we learned that the government didn't believe that the UK needed farmers. Neither of these predictions turned out well, and what we've seen is a decline in the British glasshouse area and food production for the 7th year in a row. Rising prices, empty shelves, food rationing. Some said, why not try other specialised food? Rising prices caused by reductions in production, a greater reliance on imported food, a higher market price outside the UK, and the ease of delivery and lack of red tape that overseas growers that we're relying on experience in Europe. And of course, the reluctance of UK supermarkets to pay more for the produce. Falling prices can also affect growers when there's a glut of produce dumped on the UK market from overseas when production is high, which is what we saw last year. So just to give you an overview of the Lee Valley, we're just 20 miles from Westminster. We've been here for spanning 3 centuries now. We're known as the cucumber capital of Britain, or London salad bowl. We talk about protected horticulture, meaning glasshouses, tunnels and warehouses for vertical farming. Our 4 main crops are cucumbers, peppers, tomatoes and aubergines. And one way to remember whether something is horticulture is if you can't put it through a combine harvester and it doesn't have legs, then it's probably horticulture. We can look at the way that the growing area has changed over the last century. Holland is the largest producer of glasshouse grown crops with around 24,000 acres. Spain has 100,000 acres, although much of that is produced under plastic and not glasshouses. What we've seen in Holland is between 2007 and 2021, the number of Dutch glasshouse growers nearly halved from just over 1,500 to 822. Morocco is now the #1 tomato exporter to the UK. Previously, this was Spain. However, both countries are suffering from extreme water shortages, droughts, and weather events, not to mention pests and diseases are on the increase, and that is affecting their production yields and the quality of the produce that they grow. The Lee Valley has gone full circle in terms of acreage in the last 100 years. However, technology and variety improvements has resulted in a yield some 5 times higher than back in 1900. The UK vegetable market is worth around 1.7 billion. This is the glasshouse grown sector. Last year, the value increased by about 10%, that the volume reduced by 4%, and in some categories, sales were down by over 10%. Increasing prices during a cost of living crisis affected sales, as did availability. However, versatile crops such as peppers and aubergines excelled during the main meal and also amongst older customers. British glasshouse growers only produce around 25% of the UK's fresh produce, whereas Dutch growers export 95% of their crop. There have been marked declines in the areas of tomatoes and cucumbers since the 1980s, and this coincides with the removal of infrastructure grants for glasshouse renewal at the same time. So since then, growers have pretty much been living on depreciation for glasshouses with a 15-year lifespan that have managed to make it all the way through to the 2020s. But now we're seeing that when renewal is needed, the funds are just not there. Versatile crops, for example, ones that you can cook, such as peppers and aubergines, have increased. Self-sufficiency in cucumbers, tomatoes and peppers has declined in the last 12 years, whilst aubergines has increased from a standing start. What we've seen is that obviously the glasshouse area declining for the 7th year in a row has had a knock-on effect to the amount of produce that we grow as well. In 2012, I did some growth predictions to feed the population of 73 million, which was which is what they believed would be here in 2035. I think we've pretty much got to that already. And what we worked out was that if we wanted to be self-sufficient in certain salad crops, we would need to build another 3,700 acres of glasshouses. So in comparison with Holland at 24,000 acres and Spain at 100,000, this didn't appear to be such a stretch. However, today, what we've actually seen is the glasshouse area declining. So we're importing more food, and we're not making any long-term plans to become more self-sufficient. The government's horticulture strategy has been scrapped, and in their words, that was because it was too complicated. The food strategy has been largely ignored, and there's delays to HFSS food advertising, as well as bog-off promotion restrictions. Buy one, get one free, that is. At the same time, whilst approving weight loss drugs. So there doesn't seem to be a focus on self-sufficiency from the current government. This really does demand a separate food policy from the government that substitutes healthy food as a prevention measure rather than a reliance on preventative drugs. Since then, glasshouse growers have not received any subsidies from the EU or UK government and have been working on a solely commercial basis with small profit margins. British self-sufficiency has declined to its lowest ever level. Farmers and growers have exited at a higher level as well. Since in the last 60 years, our growers have left at a rate of about 5 a year. In the last couple of years, that's doubled to about 10 a year. Many countries around the world have chosen to protect their farmers and growers by making it unlawful for retailers to sell at less than the cost of purchase. The UK government have chosen not to do the same and have allowed supermarkets to engage in price wars for the last 10 years. This has driven down prices for consumers, but at the same time driving British growers out of business. Supermarkets have sourced cheap food from further and further afield on fixed prices until last year. Overseas producers simply said no more, and the result was empty supermarket shelves. The UK's expectation that the world will supply it with cheap food has not stood up under price pressures. The result has been great for consumers who enjoyed the third cheapest food in the world. However, thousands of British farmers and growers have ceased trading during this period, with over 7,000 in just the last 3 years. The opportunity is to replace a large proportion of imported fresh produce with locally grown food. Lessons learned from COVID are that it can take 4 days travel by road from Spain or Morocco, or up to a week by road from Turkey and Egypt, to simply get produce to the UK. And that was without any border checks, conflicts of war, or global instability. Amazingly, supermarket specifications were relaxed, resulting in less food waste. British growers given essential worker status, which is now a distant memory. Plant varieties have developed at pace, and a cucumber grower achieving 50 sticks a square metre growing on straw bales, or the earth 60 years ago, can now achieve 180 sticks growing hydroponically. We use 6 times less water than overseas field crops, which is then recycled and distributed to the plants with fertilizers, minerals, and captured CO2 from the chimney flumes. Locally produced food with a lower carbon footprint using less water with less food miles that increases British food security must surely be the way forward. The first Lee Valley glasshouses were heated naturally by horse manure. This then moved to coal, then oil, then natural gas, onto biomass, burning wood chips, and now combined heat and power and anaerobic digesters. Geothermal heat can cost around £1 million a kilometre to drill down to the Earth's core, so it's not widely used in the UK, although some Dutch growers do use it. Micronuclear is also an emerging option. It's already used by some Canadian tomato growers, yet it's still yet to become commercially viable in the UK. Over the last 60 years, growers have been exiting the sector, as I said earlier, about 5 a year, but that's doubled. Food waste, or at least food rejected by the supermarkets, has risen from 5 to 20% due to tighter specifications on weight, size, aesthetics, but also due to a lack of labour with the ability to pick the fruit in time. That means we're throwing away a fifth of what we grow because it just doesn't look right or it doesn't fit a supermarket specification. And when I say throw away, I mean actually give away, because we try and give it to charity, because if we did throw it away and dump it, it would actually cost more to do so. The confidence to invest in renewable energy, even with the current grants of 25 and 40%, is not helped by the government's focus on sourcing the cheapest possible food from overseas. Ironically, food that is subsidised by the EU and the Moroccan government at a time when British growers do not receive any government assistance. Achieving waste heat by collaborating with industry is not a planning requirement and requires significant investment. Many projects do not pass the feasibility stage. For example, we had the opportunity to build a pipeline for waste heated water from a local power station some years ago that would have served around 30 growers. However, the power station owners at the time were not under any planning obligations to invest in the infrastructure and chose not to proceed. Jimmy in the slide is the association's president. He's been a grower for 40 years. He's in his 60s now. Some members of his family may wish to succeed. However, Jim is in the minority. We currently have an average age of growers in sort of 40 to 50s, not necessarily with family members that wish to succeed them. So there is a vast amount of knowledge, especially at the rate that growers are leaving at the moment, that is just disappearing from the industry, and that might be one research opportunity to try and capture that knowledge for the next generation of growers. What are the challenges for new entrants? Well, at the moment, glasshouses currently cost about £180 a square metre to build, so that's roughly £1 million an acre. And ideally, you should have at least 5 acres to grow on a commercial basis. There's no such thing as a supermarket contract. It's just an indication of how much they want and how much they'll pay for it for a certain period of time, which is normally 6 months, which means that it's difficult to find finance but on that basis from the high street lender. Vertical farms are funded in a different way. They're usually by venture capital or hedge funds, not conventional high street lenders, and therefore they can raise funds without typical repayment criteria that growers face with the conventional banks. Vertical farms are also limited to the crop types that they can produce and whether the crops they grow are commercially viable at scale and as a going concern. One grower said to me recently that you need an understanding family to be a grower. As you work long sociable hours, you can be called out during the middle of the night. You may miss various family events. The truth is, it's a lifestyle. It's not a job. It's full of risk on a daily basis. It's difficult to switch off from. The only guarantee is that something will go wrong. It's just the frequency and severity that varies. Although our growers have been collaborating with universities on robotic harvesting machines for quite a while now, over 7 years at least, the robots are not coming soon. And even when they do, they won't be able to do every job in the glass house. They may be able to pick the fruit, but they won't be able to set it up, monitor it, check it, and all those kinds of things. So it's safe to say that there won't be any robots this decade. So what are we asking for? We're basically saying that whatever investments a grower makes, whatever self-sufficiency gains that we need, the grower will need protection, because any of that effort or that profit needs to be protected from being taken by the retailer and not staying with the grower. We also need to transition to renewable energy, get away from fossil fuels. Most of our growers are still on natural gas, although that does mean that they can recycle CO2, which makes the plants grow faster. If they go onto biomass or solar, then they're going to have to generate CO2 or live with lower yields. So that will have a knock-on effect. So a research priority must surely be to introduce a food policy that rewards production rather than just land area. And also loss leader legislation that protects farmers and growers from below cost selling by the retailers. So that's all from me, and I'd be happy to take any questions.
Brilliant. Thanks so much, Lee. If you're able to stop sharing your screen, and then we'll, like you say, we'll get on to the questions. That was really interesting. Thank you. I was madly writing down loads of your stats and everything. One thing, we've got a few questions, but I just wanted to quickly pick up, if I may, on, you mentioned, you were talking a lot about the retailers and how that the relationship between retailers and producers might be different in other countries. I'm just wondering whether anybody has looked into the nitty-gritty contract details of how those relationships operate in other countries, particularly in our European neighbours, to see how they compare, and if there are, are there ways that other countries operate where their growers are much more, like you say, protected and valued by retailers, and it's more of a sort of ongoing relationship.
I don't think anyone has looked into it in detail, because whenever it's raised by farmers and growers, the current thinking is, well, we'll just let the market decide rather than intervening in any kind of price agreements. But there's obviously a lot of unrest with farmers and growers in Europe at the moment. Not on several different levels, not just with retailers, but with policies that are happening as well. So for us, it obviously makes sense for a farmer and grower who's looking to invest in their business, that they see the benefit of that investment, and it's not just taking away with a reduction because the cost of production is going down. That doesn't mean that the price of sale should go down as well, because they've made the investment, so they should keep the benefit. And that, the way that the market is working at the moment, that's not happening.
So in other countries, particularly other European countries, is that different? Are growers more protected through legislation perhaps, or regulations to prevent retailers taking more of a share of those, like you say, those efficiencies and those gains?
Yeah, so the legislation in several countries means that retailers are not allowed to sell at less than the cost of purchase. So you have several supermarkets for the last 10 years who have been doing that precisely in order to gain market share. And what happens is the rest of the retailers will start to price match the ones that are selling less than the cost of purchase, and they will go back to their suppliers, farmers and growers, and try and get them to reduce their prices. So it's an artificial market. The prices are artificially low, and the only losers from it are the primary producers.
Just want to pick up on all of this with a question from Isabel Fletcher from the University of Edinburgh, who says, what specific kinds of protection would growers like from the UK government?
I think there has to be some kind of formula around cost of production and the cost of purchase, and there has to be more transparent contracts between retailers and primary producers. As I say, at the moment, there isn't such a thing as a contract. A grower can invest millions of pounds into a new facility, even into new packing lines for certain, if the retailer decides they want to pack something in a different way, they may go and invest millions into that. And then 6 months later, there's nothing to stop the retailer saying, oh, we've changed our mind. We'll go back and do something else. And the grower is out of pocket. So, you know, some might say that, well, that's a commercial decision, but at the moment, primary producers are price takers. They have no leverage as far as the price is concerned. So there needs to be an intervention. Otherwise, we are going to see exactly what happened last year, where the retailers take a decision either to leave the shelves empty or to pay a higher price.
What about also, I mean, I'm seeing some questions here, for example, from Sarah Bridle, who is actually one of our co-leads. She's asking, how feasible is it to have the extra 3,700 glass houses in the UK that you mentioned? You know, what are the barriers except for the politics and policies? And I kind of just wanted to throw in with that, what sort of infrastructure would be needed to, you know, to expand in that way, or to make things easier and better for growers in terms of, I'm guessing, access to, you know, like you said, renewables, water, all of these sorts of things.
Well, in an ideal world, if you're going to build that amount of glass houses from scratch, you would initially have some kind of renewable energy attached to it, because you're going to need a vast amount of people for a long time. You would probably need on-site accommodation, because one thing's for certain is that British people don't want seasonal jobs. So regardless of whether they want manual jobs or not, they don't want seasonal ones. So we are having to rely on overseas workers like we have since the 1950s. So that's not new, and that's not going to change anytime soon. So obviously, although we do use a lot less water and it's recycled through trickle irrigation, we still need a water source, a sustainable water source. We can collect water from the glasshouse roofs. We do that already, and we recycle it. But a lot of the growers are still on borehole water from aquifers. So yeah, you need people, you need water, you need energy, and that would be the ideal planning situation.
How does our supporting infrastructure, water, renewables, all of this sort of thing, and like you said, access to labour, how does that compare to other countries in Europe? You mentioned, I think, the Netherlands, you know, where there is a lot more horticulture production.
Yeah, well, in Europe, they're not restricted by who can come and work for them. So they have an advantage because anyone from Europe can go and work in Europe, apart from us. So they don't have the labour restrictions that we do now. So that's one concern they haven't got to worry about. They're also supported a lot more by their own governments and by the EU. Food is subsidised in Europe. It's not subsidised in the UK. We don't even have a food policy on what we want to grow. The only policies we have are environmental ones about growing trees. So we have to, you know, there just seems to be an arrogance of, we'll just let other people feed us cheaply. And what we're finding is that they don't want to. They don't necessarily want to drive for a week to get here and go back with an empty load. They don't necessarily want to deal with the retailers on a fixed price basis because they're not used to it. They're used to the market going up and down depending on the season and whatever in Europe. It's just much more flexible, and the consumer decides whether or not they want to buy it because the tomatoes have gone up 20p a pack that week or not. So it seems to work quite well. And I think then there has to be a complete change in attitude if we want to get more self-sufficient.
Yeah, thank you. And I guess sort of moving on from that to different, there's lots of questions, or a few questions here about producer organisations and the role that they have. So there's one from David Barling, University of, I think it must be Hertfordshire, I can't see it here. What support can producer organisations offer to sides of veg producers, and how should the government revise and improve this support mechanism?
Yeah, the POs were not very well received in the UK. What happened was a few were set up. It was meant to be on an entirely cooperative basis between growers. I think the way that the market is over here, it's artificially competitive. It's much different to the way it is in Europe, and to try and get 5 growers to agree something was turned out to be a little bit hard. Plus, of course, whenever they bought some machinery or that, then 2 years later they could be penalised by the authorities because it didn't fit within the criteria. So it was very messy. We had growers who were parts of POs in Spain where you could pretty much buy anything, and you would get a check within a week. Yet in the UK, if you tried to apply for a new piece of machinery, it might take you 6 months. They might agree it, but then 2 years later, they might say, well, actually, we shouldn't have agreed that. So the administration of it was off-putting and financially penalising for many of them. So it's those are the reasons it hasn't worked. But it did work in Europe. So maybe in the future, if things had changed, then it could work again. Yeah.
So what were the key things you think that in Europe that ensured that it did work?
I think their red tape was just more relaxed. Their bureaucracy was more relaxed. And I think they've got a different attitude towards their farmers and growers and their food producers. I just think they just put them on a higher level than we do in the UK. I think we just expect everything to be on the shelf and don't really pay any attention to all the work, effort, and risk that's gone into getting it there. So, and I think that filters down from the top.
So, I mean, ultimately, this, just picking up on what you're saying, ultimately, feeding through, sort of thinking ahead, this idea of just sort of leaving everything to the market and, like you said, relying on the rest of the world to feed us. I think you used the word arrogant earlier. Where longer term, like where are we heading? What do you see as being the sort of scenario sort of that we're coming towards if nothing changes?
Well, the government are actively encouraging the retailers to source food from further afield. So they're not paying any attention to self-sufficiency, or they're not implementing any policies to increase UK food production. So the direction of travel is that we'll just get it from further and further away. And when you sign trade deals with Mexico, who are one of the largest producers of tomatoes, peppers, and cucumbers, then what some people would have thought was ridiculous at importing that sort of produce from Mexico when you can grow it here is suddenly it's becoming a reality. But of course, they won't do it at the prices that we're prepared to pay. So that's economics means that it's the reason it's not happening. Although some would have you believe that that is the answer.
There's a question here around training the next generation of growers. I mean, I'm guessing that's assuming there are enough people who want to stay in the industry or enter the industry, given the difficulties in it. It's from an anonymous attendee who says, do you have any suggestions for how government can support training the next generation of growers?
Yeah, I mean, we have trailblazer apprentices. We also have courses in certain agricultural colleges that that look into horticulture and post-production horticulture. Many of the students are overseas students who attend those courses. It is very difficult to kind of sell the industry. I'm obviously not doing a very good job today on myself because it is hard. It is hard work. It is full of risk, and there is a career path available. I think one of the problems that we find is that we're mainly in rural areas without public transport. And when we're trying to get people at the sort of 18, 19 stage, if they haven't got transport themselves, then it's a big barrier. And it sounds, it sounds like a small barrier, but we've found over the years that it's one of the main reasons why people won't look into this industry, because they're just not sure whether they can get to us. So it is a hard sell, and again, it's seasonal. So people want a 12-month job; they don't necessarily want a 9-month job. And although a lot of our growers do supply all year round, that is in the minority now, and a lot of the crop workers are only, well, if they're on the seasonal worker scheme, they can only come for 6 months. But the season at the moment is being reduced. We're planting later and we're finishing earlier because we can't get the labour, and the energy prices are still 2-3 times higher than what they were 3 years ago.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a lot of everything coming together all at once, isn't it? I guess what at this point, is there anything, what would be the most critical thing to put in place as a building block for sort of moving on from this point?
As far as growers are concerned, I mean, there'll be a natural contraction in the number of growers. The actual land area might stay roughly the same or decline as it has been over the last 7 years. But you've got growers in sort of middle age who are thinking, do I spend £5 million in improving or expanding my area now with a 25-year return on investment, or do I just spend it on something else or not borrow it at all? So it's kind of, we've already gone past that. We've had empty glass houses for 2 years where growers have already they've left them empty because they've decided it's not worth it. So those have gone for light industrial units. They've been repurposed, as you might say. Some have gone for housing. They're not coming back. So it's difficult because you're trying to encourage people into the industry because it is rewarding. It's it's a great environment to work in. Just the smells and the sounds and working with plants, and if that's your thing, then it's the best job you can have. But there's so many other pressures that go with it. It's and a lot of growers are discouraging their sons and their daughters from taking it on because they know how hard it is. They know how they're treated by the retailers, and they just don't want that for their family. So it's very difficult.
There's a question here, I guess that is about potentially tackling that in some ways, or kind of kickstarting things. Looking at public procurement and the role of public procurement in supporting domestic production. Says it looks like there is interest among political parties in a target for publicly procured food being required to be domestically produced around 50%. Will this work, and can it help the sector?
It will only work if there's legislation to make it work, because we receive messages from the NHS that want us to bid for certain things and provide certain produce to them. But at the end of the day, it boils down to price, and if you're undercut on price, you're up against major organisations that supply government agencies. So for a small producer, it's a non-starter really, and And again, a bit like the planning system, there isn't anything to obligate them to use local. It's just, the price is king, and if someone else is cheaper, then that's what they'll go with.
Mm. So yeah, again, I feel like a lot of what you're saying is legislation is really necessary for a lot of this, isn't it? Like you said, with retailers and with things like this. You mentioned earlier with infrastructure around renewables, and sort of, sourcing energy. There's a question here that's related to that, which is from Andrew Jarvis. What role, if any, does the land use planning system have to play in the current situation and potential solutions?
The land use planning system.
Yeah, so I think he just means like the planning system.
Well, I mean, we had to win a judicial review in order to build 25 acres of glass, because we had to prove that it was an appropriate development in the greenbelt. That cost hundreds of thousands of pounds. So you would hope that now building glass houses would not necessarily be an issue. The issues around it revolve around economics now. It's just who would be able to raise the funds to do it based on a promise from a retailer rather than a contract. Where would they get the staff from? Where would they house them? How much would that cost? There's so many variables that the planning system could help a lot if it obligated industry to share their waste heat, and there was more joined up thinking as far as co-locating, growing, whether it's vertical or glass houses or whatever, just using a bit of common sense as to if someone's looking to build a factory or anything that produces waste heat, then it should be automatically a consideration as to whether you can put a food producing facility next to it of whatever kind, whatever size.
So if the government and the planning system was thinking really strategically about this, would we sort of envisage something where all the sort of energy sources are kind of identified, like you say, industry is identified, and we would actually have almost, rather than sort of veg and salad growing in a very specific part of the country, I'm thinking particularly in terms of glass houses, they would be more sort of spread out according to where those energy sources are. Is that a thing or
Well,
not?
yeah, because I mean, geographically for glass houses, it doesn't really matter
Yeah,
because
that's what I was wondering.
it used to, because we're here because we're a day's we're half an hour's travel to the centre of London now. But back then, we grew in the soil, so there was loads of water. We was right next to our market, but now you don't have to be right next to your market because supermarket depots are spread out all over the UK. So as long as you're within reasonable distance of a supermarket depot, then actually locating glass houses in clusters doesn't. It's not really a priority anymore.
So they could be more spread out according to where those energy sources are then. That something that, if you were thinking strategically about it, would that be something that we would do?
Yeah, because the energy, it used to be that labor was your highest costs, but now it's energy by far. Although if they keep putting up the minimum wage, it might overtake it again. But yeah, energy is the biggest overhead, so it would make sense.
Do you know if anybody has sort of looked into the possibility of that seriously, like what the potential is for glass houses to be linked up with those sorts of energy sources? Is that something
Well,
that's been looked
we've
at
done
at
it
all?
ourselves with
Oh,
with
you've
the
done it.
local
Okay.
power station.
Mm,
The feasibility study said it will cost them 3 million to build the pipeline to
mm,
supply 30 growers who would then not need to burn gas. That could be paid back over 25 years, but because there wasn't any obligation to do it, they didn't do it. So I mean, we've looked into it. There are already growers that are attached to renewable energy, British Sugar, and although they don't grow edibles anymore, uh,
mm.
marijuana. But apart from that, there are spread all over the UK. There are glass houses attached to renewable energy sources.
Okay, so following on from that, there's a question here from Judith Irons. She says, I'm wondering if you as an industry have any visibility on where anaerobic digesters are being built on livestock farms. I'm guessing this is a question around whether there's any, whether that could be used as an energy source in terms of energy from, the anaerobic digesters from livestock farms.
Well, we have one anaerobic digester, a grower who has got several acres of tomatoes. They also have other renewable energy sources as well. It is a very tough job running an anaerobic digester. It's you have to get the right balance of waste. It's not just you can't. I mean, we used to take all the waste from Spitalfields Market in London, fruit and veg waste that was, but you can't just put lots of one thing into an anaerobic digester. It just won't work. You'll kill the bugs. So it's not as easy as some might have you think. And I think reading the other day, I don't think it seems to be a priority for the future either. I think the gains that you can make just reducing food waste and not having to put it in a AD plant at the end anyway. There's so many other things that you can do. Relaxing supermarket specifications, buying on weight rather than buying per piece, buying loose. It's a big thing to change the consumer's mindset, but they do it in Europe. They peppers are twice the size in Europe because they sell them on weight, whereas the ones over here you try to squeeze 3 of them into a small pack because it looks nicer. There's other things that you can do rather than concentrate on all the waste that's being produced at the moment.
What about in terms of I know methane from dairy cows being looked at as a possible energy source. Is there any sort of are you aware of anyone sort of looking into that and how that could be sort of used in glass houses? Is that something that you could envisage being useful?
Yeah, they are doing that in West Sussex, which is another sort of large glasshouse area as well. So I am aware that seems to be working at the moment. Unfortunately, in London and Essex and Hertfordshire, we don't have that many cows, so it's a little bit different from where we are geographically.
Yeah. There's a question here. There's a few questions actually about the role of smaller scale production systems. Lucia from the Soil Association says, what role do you see from smaller scale and agroecological production systems in contributing towards self-sufficiency in fruit and veg?
Do you mean like smaller farmers, smaller growers?
Yeah, I think so. Smaller kind of, I guess, possibly those sorts of, smaller kind of systems that might be located sort of closer to cities, often a sort of peri-urban type system.
Yeah, well, for example, over the last 15 years, I've met many vertical farmers who have started off well and found markets locally, and as a little bit more than a cottage industry, but as a small business have made a decent living from focusing on local. I mean, to be fair, it's the kind of thing that works well in London. It might not necessarily work in other areas, but I think so. There is a place for it. As soon as you start wanting to sell to retailers, you have several hoops to jump through with regards to food assurance schemes and audits and things like that, and it adds cost to the business, and then you need to scale, and then that's another cost, and I think that's where it falls down. So there is a small size, there is a kind of a business model that works for certain people, small producers, but only if the local market is prepared to pay a premium for their product. As soon as you start looking to expand and scale and sell to supermarkets, then that's where it stops working.
So can you envisage any alternative model, I guess, where you would be able to skip out the supermarket, where it's not so much the system that we've just been talking about just now, where, like you say, it's often sold at a premium and only certain people can probably access it. But is there a different model that growers can envisage or would like to see that means that the profits are not being creamed off by the supermarkets? You're accessing consumers much more directly, possibly, but you're able to access a large number of consumers, not just those who can afford to pay more. Is there anything that
Yeah,
has
well, I mean,
been thought about like that?
we have some growers that supply wholesale markets, so they will, they will load up their van and deliver their produce to a wholesale market in the early hours. They will also have on-site sales where they have food companies come and collect the produce from them. So they're not. You couldn't say that they're in full distribution like they would be with a supermarket, but they are selling their produce to alternative markets, and then you've also got producers that sell at farmers markets and to other independent retailers. But transport is always a concern because they're not necessarily going to collect it, and you're going to have the infrastructure to deliver. So it is working. It's not the norm. It's not the preferred option at the moment.
Is that something that would be of interest if someone was to sort of research some sort of alternative models that could be done at scale? Do you think that's something that would be
Yeah,
interesting?
why not? Because I think a lot of growers now are supermarkets used to want exclusivity, so they didn't want you to deal with other supermarkets. And a lot of the growers have said no now. They're not putting all their eggs in one basket. They're hedging their bets. They're servicing more than one retailer at the same time. And they're also doing smaller orders for other groups, like yogurt makers who buy cucumbers and stuff like that. They're spreading their risk, as it were. So yeah, it has moved away from the traditional, someone serves this supermarket, someone serves that one. There's a lot of crossover now and variety.
There's a question in the chat about climate change and whether you could flesh out a little bit more how the sector will be impacted by climate change.
Well, I suppose we have to keep the temperature in a glass house at around 20 degrees constantly, regardless of what's happening outside. So if the weather's warmer, then we don't need to burn as much gas as we are at the moment, or we don't need to use as much energy. But what we do need to do is open the vents, open the doors, which leaves you viable to sort of other things that can go wrong, like pest infestation and stuff like that. So if you look in other countries, they're not concerned with heating the crop; they're concerned with cooling it down. So in the Middle East, etc., they'll have fans instead of heating pipes. So they're constantly trying to cool it down to 20 degrees rather than heat it up. So there's a climate change for us could mean that we start to experience water shortages or water restrictions. I mean, we wasn't charged for water until a couple of years ago. Trickle irrigation used to be exempt, so we could draw it from the borehole and use it because we use so little compared to arable farmers or extensive farmers that it wasn't a concern. But now we're charged for water, so and what happens if that water becomes scarce? Are we going to be charged more, or is it going to be available at all? Is it going to be rationed? No one thought food was going to be rationed, but if there's not enough water to go around, then it may be rationed. Maybe food producers might lose a crop. Who knows? It's so energy and water, the two main components of growing anything. So it could affect us quite badly.
Yeah, I think water is going to be a huge one. I was actually at the Norfolk Farming Conference a couple of days ago, and I asked the farming minister why we don't have a water strategy, and he described, he sort of said, oh, well, we could be communist about it and invest in infrastructure. I thought, well, yes, you could invest in water infrastructure, or we could give farmers lots of grants, you know, to enable them to do it themselves. So I think, oh my gosh. So anyway, that's a whole thing. I don't want to go off on one, but very lastly, before we finish, Lee, what would you like from the research community? What do you think the research community could really do for the sector?
Well, firstly, I'd like them to come up with something that I haven't even thought of yet. That would be nice. So I think if if they want to help increase our self-sufficiency, then I think the research that needs to go into it is to how do we encourage, how do we incentivize growers to make that investment, to build the infrastructure to grow more food. And when we can grow so much more in protected horticulture, like 600,000 cucumbers or aubergines an acre a year, which is massively more than you could ever achieve in a field. 3 tons of wheat out of an acre of field. So, as far as I'm concerned, protected horticulture is the way to go in whatever form, because it produces the most from less. So the research needs to be, how can we encourage it? Whether that's by, and a lot of it will revolve around government policy, because we're not subsidising food, everyone else is. So if you want food from the UK, then you're going to have to join in.
Mm. And just very quickly, because I feel like we should have touched on it, there's a question about vertical farming. Is it viable? Is it something we should be researching?
At the moment, it's not, and I think the evidence is that no one's actually made a profit from it. So I don't think anyone can kind of challenge me on that. But it will evolve. It is, as I said earlier, it's profitable on a small scale at the moment. The problem is when you try and scale it, because at the end of the day, a lot of vertical farmers are selling a product that doesn't have a large retail value, and it can easily be sourced cheaper from overseas. So if your end market is the retailer, then there's no reason for them to deal with you differently than they would a glasshouse grower, because a lot of the buyers don't even know the difference, or don't even have never visited a glasshouse or a vertical farm. So I think it's viable in other countries because of the way that the market works, but in the UK it hasn't been so far. But that's not to say it won't be in the future.
Brilliant, Lee. Thank you so much. We're running a couple of minutes late, but there were so many good questions. I think that's okay. So thank you so much for your insights and answering all those questions from everybody. Thank you everybody for attending and engaging so much. There are always so many great questions. So thank you everyone for that. So our next webinar is going to be on the 28th of February. That will be part 2 to this webinar. So Lee is obviously focused on vegetables and salad crops. On the 28th, though, part 2 will focus on fruit with Ali Kappa. Ali is an apple grower and chair of British Apples and Pears, and the NFU Horticulture Board member as well. So I'll share a link to that in the chat in just a second. But just to say as well, if you want to look at our back catalogue of webinars, we've got quite a lot now. If you've missed any previous ones, you can do that on our YouTube channel. Again, I'll share the link in a second. And, we welcome any comments and suggestions for speakers and interviewees that you'd like to have in this series. So email me or Neil if you have any ideas. So thanks everybody again, and we'll see you in a couple of weeks, hopefully. Lee, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Neil, if you can press stop record.